Welcome to Challenge 2 in the Variables, Strings, and Functions series of projects. In this lesson, we're going to look at writing our very own first function. And this is much like the project where we created our first variable. It's your first introduction to a new structure. So let's quickly go over what we're going to do here, which is we're going to try and look at this code and see if we can come up with a way to sort of make it both more flexible and shorter at the same time. And we do that by creating something that we call a function. So you should have already learned in your JavaScript lessons that a function can help you anytime you want to repeat the same code multiple times. It's a way of shortening your code and making it easier to manage. You've actually used functions in Swift already quite a bit. If you look at the code that I'm highlighting here, you'll see that it has this keyword func in it. Here, I'll highlight it right there. And that keyword has to do with the fact that a button action is actually a function. When I click the button, I'm triggering the function called bottom button action. Okay, so you've actually written several functions before, only Xcode created something we call the function header or function declaration for you. It filled in most of the parts for the first line of the function. But as I said, you have been using functions. What goes inside the function is the code that you want to execute. So when I click the bottom button, I want these two lines of code to execute. However, if you look at the code in each of these functions, you'll notice something. They're essentially the same. There's only one little tiny bit that's different. And if we're repeating the same exact code multiple times, that's usually a clue that there's probably a better way to do it. So, in this lesson, we're going to learn one way to do that by creating our own helper function to perform some of these tasks so that we don't have to write as much code. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So, what we're going to do is we're going to write our very own function from scratch. Now, if you look at the functions that we already have, you'll see that they have some things in common. Well, first, ignore this part because this has to do with linking a function to a storyboard, and so instead we'll look at the very first part, this word right here, the word func, and this is something we call a keyword, and we learned about keywords in the previous lesson when we were learning about variables. There was the keyword var when we were declaring a variable. Well, in the same way, there's a keyword func in front of a function. Okay, after that, we have after that we have the name of the function, which is going to be whatever we call our function name. Okay? After that, the next thing that we have to have is our list of things that go into the function. So you'll notice in each of these examples here of the functions that we've already seen, they have these parentheses. And those parentheses are your clue that you're actually looking at a function. If there's a pair of parentheses after what looks like it could be a variable name, then you're looking at a function and not a variable. But you're allowed to put something inside those parentheses. And generally what you put inside those parentheses is whatever is needed for the function to do its job. Because functions fundamentally do things. So we'll have to decide, and we call these things arguments. And these are the things that are needed to do the job. And they take the form of variables. So it's going to look a lot like what we did in the first lesson. Okay? So What are we going to do next? Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make some space here. So I'm going to scroll my screen. You don't need to do this, but I just want to be able to be writing my code here more towards the middle of your screen. Okay, so the last thing that we have to do is we have to include our curly braces, which represent the start and end of the function. Okay, so let's do each of these steps for this new function that we're going to write. So the very first thing that we're going to do is write the keyword func, followed by the function name. Well, what is our function going to do? If you look at these two lines of code that we're going to be trying to replace here, what we do is we record which button was pressed, and then we add the text to the top label outlet. So we're going to call our function add text to top label. So that was step 2. We named our function. Step 3 is we have to include any arguments, and we do that by putting our parentheses in, and then inside the parentheses we put the things that we want to go into this function. Well, notice that in each of these instances here, if I look at these two lines of code, these two lines of code, and these two lines of code, only one thing changes: the name of the button here, which becomes the text that we're going to add to the label. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable in the form of an argument that will represent the text that gets added to the label. Since we're adding just text to a label, we're going to call our variable the text. And we have to say what kind of information. Remember, when we create a variable, it's like we're creating a box that has a certain name, which is written on the outside of the box. That's the text. That's how I find the box. And then we have to specify what kinds of things the box is allowed to hold. And a string is information that is in the form of letters, numbers, and symbols. So that's going to be the thing that I'm going to give to my function so it can do its job. This text is what's going to get added to the label in my function. Okay, so what I've done is I've written something called a function declaration or a function header, and that is the start point for my function. My curly braces represent the beginning of my function and the end of my function. And in between those curly braces, I can put the code for what I want my function to do. Well, what I'm essentially going to be doing is replacing this code, which means I'm going to record what buttons have been pushed, and I'm going to do it by taking all the buttons that have been pushed so far, and I'm going to add, but instead of adding bottom, left, or right, I'm going to add this unknown thing called the text. And then I'm going to set my top label equal, or the text of my top label, equal to buttons pushed. So you notice that my function looks almost exactly like each of these, only the only thing that's different is I've used a generic thing here to represent whatever text I want to actually add. Okay, so I've got my function, I've written it, but when you have a function, it doesn't do anything unless you do something called calling the function. Imagine that I wrote a really cool bottom button action here, and then I never had a bottom button that triggered that. Would the function ever do anything? And of course it wouldn't. I have to somehow call the function so that it actually triggers and does something. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to call the function that I just wrote from each of these button actions. So I'm going to go ahead and add a line in here. I'm going to say add text to top label. And then what text do I want to add if they clicked the bottom button? Well, I want to add bottom. And that means I'm going to stop, jump down here, Bottom is going to take the place of the text. So I'm then going to take button pushed, make it equal to all the buttons that have already been pushed, and add the text. Well, what is the text in this case? The bottom. Then I'm going to take the top label, .text, and make it equal to all the buttons that have been pushed. And that means that I've effectively done these two lines of code by calling my function. And that also means that I could do the same thing down here. I'm going to add text to top label by calling my function. So I'm going to leave you here because what the rubric asks you to do is what I've done so far, and then it asks you to modify your code so that it uses this function call in these last two methods, which will shorten your program a little bit. When you're done with that, you should be able to run your program, and when you run your program, it should act exactly the same way as it did before. It just does it in a different way. So this time, when you have one of us check your project, we have to actually look at your code more than we have to look at how your app runs to see if you completed this project. All right, this one's very short. Good luck.